Good morning, members and guests here at the convention. Thank you very much for having me back. There's a vote of confidence, I presume, in the previous presentation. And, you know, I should congratulate you on choosing this topic. It's something I've had a long-standing interest in, and it's hugely important. I mean, you'll have gathered by this stage that there's, you know, a very strong school of thought which really places a lot of the difficulties we might see in the Irish parliamentary system on the consequences of the electoral system. But what I want to talk to you about is maybe this other issue that the Chairman has talked about what goes on within Parliament and how perhaps tweaking things a little bit can have quite profound effect on the sort of what Parliament does. I mean, if we think of Parliament like a factory producing things and doing things, like how can we make it better and more efficient and improve its performance in relation to various things. I sent a note, hopefully you've seen. I tried to keep it quite short, including detailing some of the major reforms that have been proposed to give you a flavour of the fact that, you know, the idea of reforming the Dáil is not very new. In fact, I was looking at some stuff last night going back to the 1970s, you know, 40 years ago. There was a very similar atmosphere. There was a lot of talk about constitutional change and reform of Parliament, that this was long overdue. So this is a long-standing issue, but I think this is a fantastic opportunity. The Convention can have a very powerful voice, external to Parliament, in saying what might usefully, what trajectory Dáil reform might usefully take. By way of background, again, as the Chairman have said, I mean, within Ireland, we're creeping up on the, a century since 1919 and the first Dáil, and it's something we're very proud of. We tend to forget we've one of the longest established parliamentary democracies in the world, and yet, consistently, there's always been this perception that we inherited a system and it's been frozen since, and it's really not fit for purpose, is the term commonly used nowadays. And this is a phrase that I can't remember where I found it, but it is a true phrase, and it was spoken by Michael Yeats. He was a senator. He was one of the first members of the European Parliament. Once Ireland joined, he was the son of William Butler Yeats, and he was in Brussels, I presume, and he's inviting a delegation from New Zealand over, and they were talking about difficulties they were having with their Parliament, and he said, well, if you ever want to see what they were saying about how the House of, the New Zealand Parliament very much reflected Westminster in 1947, because this was the period when New Zealand set up their independent parliament. He says, oh, well, come to Ireland sometime and see how the House of Commons was in 1922, because nothing has changed since, the Free State Constitution was written. But what I want to propose to you is that this isn't really true. There's quite a lot has gone on, which I think the convention members should be aware of before they start their deliberations. Again, these are the caricatures. I mean, there's some justification and understanding here that our parliament is, one of the weakest, and particularly in terms of its ability to hold the executive to account. Yet what that means is quite tricky in detail. That it's a weak parliament, a puny parliament. These are quotes from various authors who've written on the Oireachtas. That it's very poor at bringing together interests. Okay, people remain very loyal to their parties. It's very hard to get cross-party agreement on issues. On the other hand, people from the outside looking in going, you know what, you're very lucky in Ireland. You tend to have quite stable governments. You tend to have quite responsive governments, in good and bad ways. You can take decisions quite quickly. I mean, if we think even, almost this time last year, the liquidation of Anglo-Irish Bank, that had to happen. That could be done very, very quickly. And sometimes that's very necessary, and that is needed. But of course, we often hear the complaint about the use of the guillotine, or time limitations on legislation and so on as well. So there's two sides to this, of course. And the whole issue about Dáil reform, and really, as we'll see in a second, I mean, the Constitution provides that the House must reserve the right to reform itself. It depends on which side of the House you're on. And traditionally, I mean, generally speaking, parties in opposition are all in favour of big reforms and things to open up the opportunity for them to get involved and to do more things in the legislature, whereas governments tend not to be, okay, and for a number of reasons want to sort of maintain and hold on to control of the agenda and what goes on in Parliament, okay? So it's a trade-off. There's two very distinctive views about how Parliament should run. One is that the government should be allowed to expedite its business and get on with things that it's been elected to do. And on the other hand, you have the opposition saying, well, this is not democracy, we're being cut out of the process, there must be greater equilibrium between the two sides of the chamber, as it were, between opposition and government. the government is not the sole repository of wisdom. There's lots of wisdom and good ideas in the opposition, and how can these feed into the policy process? Now, the last time I spoke to you last May, and I won't go through these all again, but just to say to you, we sort of agreed that the Constitution says, when we're speaking about the electoral system, that these are the tasks of Parliament. And when we're talking about Dáil reform, really what we're focusing on here is two key tasks of Parliament. It's the production of legislation, the law-making function, which is kind of a litmus test of a legislature, and then oversight of the executive. I've just grouped these two together here. So it's the financial oversight is part of oversight of government generally. So I'm going to focus mainly in on this second issue here. Okay, the parameters though. First of all, what determines the rules, the way Dáil Éireann, the lower house, works? Well, there's kind of a hierarchy. At the top, you have the Constitution. You might have heard of this. This is what it says in the Constitution. Each house shall make its own rules and standing orders. Okay, so that's there. As we know, the Constitution says nothing about political parties and the reality of sort of party competition, but it says it's the job of the Seanad to make its own rules and the job of the Dáil to make their own rules, and that's where it lies. At the second level, then you have the actual rule book. This is about 10 years old now, the 2002 version. So there's a rule book. This is called the standing orders relative to public business. There's one for the Seanad and one for the Dáil, and thirdly, there's also standing orders for private business, but that's the Dáil and the Seanad mainly do their business in public. And thirdly, I don't have a copy of it, but there's a kind of a book of precedents called the Salient Rulings of the Chair, and both the Ceann Comhairle and the Dáil and the Cathaoirleach and the Seanad have these, and it's a kind of, what's happened before, what precedents have been set, what is acceptable language in Parliament, and what you can and can't do, and so on. So these are the three levels, and obviously the role of the Constitution is looking primarily at the Constitution, the first issue, but hopefully over the course of the day and tomorrow you'll have more consideration of the standing orders, because this is really, it's like any organisation in the world, you need rules, and the rules determine who can speak, when they can speak, what you can do, what you can't do, and this is very, very important for what it is the Parliament does. Now, in respect of lawmaking, just to go through these, the lawmaking function, this is the numbers of pieces of primary legislation that have been produced by the Houses of the Oireachtas since 1922. So over the last, 90 years, the average, okay, it fluctuates wildly because some years you have elections, so the Parliament isn't sitting. In other years, you might have a flurry of small bits of small legislation. I mean, what this doesn't tell you is about over time, legislation has generally become more complex and longer. In fact, just before Christmas was one of the longest pieces of legislation in the history of the state. It was the consolidation of all the Companies Acts, and it took an enormous amount of time to put together, but hundreds of pages long. And you'll have other pieces which are very short, okay? So you're not really necessarily comparing like with like. But the red line there is the important one. And over time, the amount of legislation going through Parliament, of primary legislation, hasn't increased massively. There's a lot more, there's a lot more secondary legislation, but that has tended to fluctuate over time as well. There's something to be said for, you would like to see, if the role of Parliament, of the legislature is to produce legislation, you would expect over time that it would become more efficient, that there would be greater productivity, particularly as we'll see in the context of reforms that have happened over the last 30 years, the move towards more automation and modernisation, that there would be more throughput of law in Parliament. But these are the figures. This is from the Irish Statute Book online. This is the actual acts of Parliament that have passed into law. There have been others proposed that don't become law. This is what's actually become law. Now, I don't want to say too much more about that, because what I really want to focus in on, and this seems to be the issue that really animates people when we talk about Dáil reform, it is this perception that the Irish Parliament is at one end of a spectrum, and that spectrum goes from the parliaments that kind of struggle to hold government to account to the other end, where they maybe have, their parliaments have quite a lot of ability to hold government to account, to the point of stopping government in their tracks if necessary. Now, there's three principal ways, and apologies if I'm covering some ground that Art might have covered last night. The three principal mechanisms available to members of Parliament to hold the executive, which they have elected to account, are parliamentary questions, which are very much the lifeblood of the accountability system. And you talk to any civil servants and you say PQs and they throw their eyes up to heaven and go, oh, don't talk to me. But it is this ability to ask a question about any aspect of our system of government, through state agencies, civil service, local government, health systems. It's not necessarily that the question's ever asked, it's that the question can be asked. This is absolutely vital to the system of accountability at all levels within the bureaucracy as well. Okay, that something might be asked, so the records must be kept, there must be order, there must be a system in place for retrieving information. Debate, obviously, when you debate on legislation, the Parliament debates on issues as they arise, and through the course of debate, questions are asked and statements are made. And this is very important. This release of information into the public domain is part of the public accountability role of Parliament. This is absolutely vital. Parliament sits on the sort of boundary between state and society, and so this release of information is a very important part of our democratic process. And finally, and I know this will come up later in the day, particularly with Mary Murphy's presentation, is the committee system. There's always been committees, but over the last 20 years, their number has expanded and they've really become institutionalised. Kind of late compared to other parliaments in Europe, it has to be said, but they're now absolutely part and parcel of the parliamentary system in Ireland, but also the accountability process as well. Now, in terms of PQs, there's some interesting graphics here. This is the number of parliamentary questions answered, not necessarily tabled, but answered in the Parliament from 1960 to 2012. And I remember interviewing some people, older parliamentarians, about this, and they said back in the day, in the mid-60s, pretty much everything, questions were asked in Parliament and answered in Parliament. The only ones that weren't were usually statistical information that you couldn't really read out, there were tables and so on. But over time, you just see this huge increase. And there are a number of reasons for this. I mean, what the state does has increased rapidly, particularly from the early 70s, not just because of EU membership, but for other reasons as well. You have a lot more, and I think this is a very important aspect of parliamentary life in Ireland, that you have full-time politicians. It wasn't that long ago that it was a bit of a struggle to get opposition parties to attend Parliament on a fairly regular basis, to get members to do so. Many members had second jobs and so on, and would show up once a week and so on. But full-time politicians asking questions. There's a lot of other interesting dimensions to this. Of course, the introduction of freedom of information legislation, you would have thought would have diminished the amount of questions that was being asked, because there's more information available in the public domain, but or potentially available, but it's gone up, and in fact, it's shot up there in that's 2012, I think, is really quite striking increase. But of course, what's important here is that the percentage, it's down at about 3.54% of questions are actually answered in Parliament, and there is a difference. When they're answered and asked and answered in Parliament, there's some sort of engagement, the opportunity to ask a supplementary question and so on. But the vast majority are written answers, and there's still issues with them, as we've seen in the recent case of the CRC and the voluntary hospitals and so on, that the questions were asked and maybe weren't answered. I mean, there was the famous line in the early 90s of the Beef Tribunal, where the chairman said, well, if certain questions had been answered fully in Parliament, we wouldn't have had to set up this tribunal. Now, it's debatable whether that is true or not, but certainly there's a feeling that the quality of answers is not always perfect. In terms of debate, I'm going to come back to this in a minute. There's been a lot more. There's been a sort of extension of the amount of time for debate. There's a lot more debating goes on in Parliament, and we'll be talking about the committees over the course of the day as well. But suffice to say that the committees are very much part and parcel of parliamentary life nowadays. Just in terms of what has happened in terms of Dáil reform, as I said to you, the caricature has been that we inherited a system and pretty much very little has happened. In fact, quite a lot has happened. Now, a lot of it is sort of technical, tidying up things, but I just want to draw your attention to a couple of the kind of the high points on the graph here. The people who, in the context of the Irish Free State Constitution, you might recall that the founders of the Irish Free State were very, very conscious of what was happening in Westminster at that time, and that was the gradual dominance of the House of Commons by the Cabinet. Okay, in London. And they really tried. I mean, they made a conscious effort to move away from this. And you might recall from previous meetings of the convention, they tried to have mechanisms put mechanisms in the Constitution to try and allow for the opposition to have a greater insight and say as to what it was the executive was doing. But in the context of the Civil War and the kind of the settling of the party system into a very much us versus you, these really disappeared, and that's what you're seeing here in 1926, the sort of dismantling of the original standing orders to replace it with a system which, by and large, gave government quite a lot of control over how and when Parliament will sit and what it would do. And that kind of pretty much stayed, as it were, for 50 years. Now, bear in mind, as I said, that there was, you didn't have a full-time opposition parties and so on, and there was a certain feeling that, look, that's just the way Parliament worked. But there was a very long period of stasis, and that's true. The state didn't grow significantly either. It didn't sort of, the size of the administrative system, government departments didn't grow too much. In fact, government departments didn't change too much over this period either. The sort of high point here, I looked into this. This was actually quite a lot of technical stuff. There was a bit of an issue about parliamentary privilege in the early 60s, so this was just reflecting some standing orders. The most important ones here are the early 70s, and more recently in the mid-90s, the Rainbow Coalition. The early 70s, this was the first, there was an informal, it was called I don't know why it was called informal, it was the Informal Committee on Dáil Reform, and it met in the early 70s, and it was created on the back of pretty much what's happening, like I said to you here today, where there's a feeling, we really need to modernise, particularly in the context of accession to the European Union. Or the EEC as it was, that we need to modernise our parliamentary behaviour. But people I've spoken to about this say pretty much it actually tightened the executive's control over Parliament. Of course, this was quite a turbulent period with the context of the Troubles in Northern Ireland as well at this time. So the government got a very, very tight control over the parliamentary agenda. 96, 97 was different. This is the Rainbow Coalition government, and it's tend to be the case that Fine Gael Labour Party governments in Ireland have been, because these are the parties that have spent so much more time in opposition, have tended to be more inclined to change standing orders. And in the context of the Rainbow Coalition, there were some important changes to the standing orders to allow for more time for debate, to allow for more engagement of the committees, and for the committees to do more work and so on. Now, this is only up to 2008, and I just want to continue the story and to say what's happened since then. But I found an interesting article by a now retired lecturer from the University of Limerick called John Stapleton some time ago, and he was writing in 1976 in the context of the reforms in the early 70s. And he said, this is what he said, well, what the Oireachtas really needs to do is have more public access and broadcasting of proceedings. There should be more parliamentary time. There should be a better arrangement of parliamentary time. There should be a relaxation of the government monopoly in the agenda, introduction of a committee system, and greater funding of parliamentary parties and resources. And I'm just putting this up because when you think about it, we tend to say nothing has changed. A lot of these things have actually happened. There has been reform that should be recognised, okay? There have been changes, okay? Now, when you get into the detail of it, the one thing that there still seems to be an issue with is a general unhappiness with the balance of agenda-setting power between the government and the opposition in Parliament, or in effect between government and the Parliament. We tend to talk about Parliament when we mean the opposition parties. But I just think it's important to recognise it's not been a static picture as is often portrayed. There have been quite a lot of changes, particularly over the last 10 to 20 years. Now, quite recently, there have been a couple of other changes. 1995, I'm not sure if you're aware of this, there is actually, a lot of people don't know this, it still exists, it's actually in the rule book that it must be created. There was the Committee on Procedures and Privileges created a subcommittee on Dáil Reform. That committee actually produced a report that led to the establishment of the Houses of the Oireachtas Commission, which is a very important body that runs the Parliament and funds the various activities in the Parliament. It still exists. I think it's one of 3 committees in the Oireachtas that actually has, I could be wrong in this, but has a majority of opposition members on it. It's chaired by the Chief Whip. But I'm not sure what it does anymore, to be honest. I'm not sure if it has produced a report in recent times at all. Again, in the context of reform, there's been a lot of modernisation, a lot more use of IT. So the Parliament has become a much more efficient place, particularly with the e-government, e-legislation initiatives. It used to be all done by hand. When legislation was amended, words were cut out and stuck on. The Bills Office, they weren't allowed to open the windows of the Bills Office in Leinster House for fear a draft would come in and blow away all the amendments. But it's all done now. Well, this is true, but now it's done by computer. Obviously, everything's recorded. So simple things, but it improves the efficiency. Committees have become much more active. But what's interesting about the Irish committee system, parliaments have to organise themselves somehow. And what we know is that the Irish Parliament very much organises itself around parliamentary parties. Not so in other parliaments where committees are very important, and particularly, in the American Congress, people really associate themselves with committee membership. I think only once in Ireland have I ever seen, I got it through the door like 10 years ago in Dublin, where a local TD put through just a hello, I'm your TD, and I'm also a member of this committee. But there was no mention of his political party on it, who were doing very badly in the polls at that time. But it's the only time I've ever seen in Irish politics something come through the door that actually made a reference to the membership of a committee rather than the membership of a party. But what you'd never seen in Ireland, which you do see sometimes in Westminster, is a committee with the government majority on it, censuring a minister or saying, the minister did something wrong. And this is, again, kind of a litmus test of, well, how mature has the committee system become when it will take on a minister, say, and that minister's party has a majority, or his government has a majority on the committee. So party loyalty is still quite a very strong feature of Irish parliamentary life. There have been, I just want to recognise, because again, the current administration since 2011, were conscious of this. I mean, it was in the programme for government to make some amendments, but even some senior members of the government have said, there's been very mixed results, okay? It is important to note there have been extensions of the parliamentary sitting time. There have been changes to the parliamentary questions. So, for example, there's more leaders' questions, I think. Sorry, I forget the detail now, even though I read over these last night. But there have been changes. There's a very important change last year to the standing orders in respect of EU business. Again, this is always thrown out in the media that Parliament is completely unable to deal with EU affairs. But actually, when you look into the detail, there have been some improvements there. The standing orders now say that the Irish government must come before the House and say what the priorities are for the government at every EU presidency, so every 6 months. I mean, this is very important. This is very important. You never hear this. There's no mention of this in the media when it actually happened. And there's greater regulation of the legislative timetable. So it's not a case of one bill being necessarily produced just after the other and the opposition having to react quickly to it. There's going to be much, allegedly, there's going to be much greater planning. Sorry, I'm coming to the end in case you're worried there. And of course, in the context of the Shannon referendum, there was talk about much greater pre-legislative scrutiny and post-legislative scrutiny as well. So there are some very good ideas floating around, and some of them have been implemented. Some seem to have worked better than others, but it needs to be recognised if we're going to have a proper debate about it. I mean, I just don't want it to resolve into a caricature of just government controls everything, the opposition get nothing. Things have moved quite a bit from that. Okay, so by way of conclusion, it is very hard to escape the constitutional provision that says the House must organise itself. I mean, what are you going to do? What referendum, what wording would you put in a referendum to change that? I mean, maybe Leah could come up with something, not to put pressure on you. There is no doubt, there have been reforms, but certainly the balance of control is very, very much with the government. And it probably, if we think of it on a spectrum, it probably is still weighted too much in favour, okay, of the government compared to other parliamentary systems. There's no perfect point in this, by the way, and it needs to be recognised as well that in some systems where the opposition have a lot of opportunity to stop the government in its tracks, things really grind to a halt, and that brings its own problems as well. There is a role for responsible opposition, just as there is a role for responsible government. Okay, opposition should not be just about trying to stop government for the sake of it. Okay, it's this idea of adding and contributing to better quality policy making and legislation in the country. So the convention, I think one of the great things the convention can do is to provide a very powerful external voice. It's very hard to reform Parliament from within it. I remember asking the late Gareth Fitzgerald about this, and he says it's because it goes to the heart of everything. He says, parliamentary reform is key to everything in our political system. But the convention, the very existence of this convention and the fact you've chosen this issue, I think is going to be really significant in terms of providing a platform for further changes to occur. There are a couple of challenges. There's the whole issue of the efficiency, the absolute right, and governments do have a right to proceed to implement their programme for government and their legislation, versus the right of the opposition parties to have democratic debate and to challenge what it is government is proposing to do. I don't want to get into this too much, but there's also the issue about quantity versus quality. You can have a lot more debate, but is it really adding anything? Is there quality debate, better quality inputs? The resources available to parliamentarians have expanded quite a lot. There's a lot of researchers in Leinster House, and as someone who's been looking at this over years, I do think the quality of inputs has definitely increased. There's a lot more good, high-quality information being provided by the Houses of the Oireachtas research and library services as well. So the standard is going up, but you got to keep pushing it. It should be the best, And there is, not to complicate things too much, but we should be cognizant of the fact that there is a changing environment. I'm not sure what's going to happen with the Senate, but what happens with the Senate reforms is going to have an influence on the Dáil reforms. There's wider changes going on about accountability in the administrative system as well. Issues to do with how civil servants are going to appear before Oireachtas committees as well. So it's not, you can't just focus on Dáil reform alone and not be cognizant of the wider environment in which the Dáil operates. I like to think of Dáil Éireann as kind of as the apex of accountability systems. But when you go back 30, 40 years, there weren't as many ombudsmen, there weren't as many regulators, there weren't as many opportunities for people to investigate different aspects of the administrative system as there are today. The Dáil is not the only forum to do this anymore, so that's important as well. Okay, I hope I have started your deliberations well for you and that this contributes to your debate. So thank you very much, Chairman. Sorry if I've run over. Okay, thank you.